Good afternoon, everybody. So today we're doing Joan of Arc, and an amazing story, amazing woman, Joan. I'm, of course, going to talk a little bit about Eleanor and what I left out from last week, and kind of crazy that I would leave anything out because I went a lot longer than I should have. But anyway, Eleanor, for her family, or the men, Henry II, and his family, I should say, there is an old tale about their background, and a woman who had lived some generations before, an old story that the family loved to tell about one of the great-great-grandfathers who married this very strange woman and had 4 children with her. But anytime they went to church, this woman had to leave in the middle of church before they served communion, because she couldn't bear to be in the same room with the wafer and the cup for some strange reason. And this went on for a number of years, and until finally they were going to practically force her to be there when they served communion in church. And it got so awful for her that even though they kind of surrounded her and tried to keep her in, she screamed and grabbed a couple of her kids and jumped out the window and escaped. And that's when they knew that she was from the devil. Now, the 2 kids who survived, or who stayed, were in the family, and they had children. And so the family, the Anjou family, from which Henry came, had this old tale that they would tell, that they were from the devil. And strangely enough, they seem to really enjoy it. And so there's a couple of quotes here. Richard once said, "What wonder if we lack the natural affections of mankind? We are from the devil and must needs go back to the devil." But I like this one even better, from Geoffrey. "Do you not know that it is our proper nature, planted in us by inheritance from our ancestors, that none of us should love the other, but that always, brother against brother and son against father, we try our utmost to injure one another." So, yeah, it was kind of a family thing that they were to grow up and to kind of hate each other. And it was well known that John, most of all, was quite openly anti-clerical and anti-church, being a very profane man and speaking many times against the priests and Christianity in general. A couple other things. Eleanor, oddly enough, when she was holding court, this is back in the day when people were very barbaric, especially by our standards, and rather filthy. But she did not allow men in her presence who had not combed their hair. Of all things, combing your hair would be important. One more thing. So Eleanor got her annulment from King Louis of France on the grounds that of consanguinity. In other words, that they were related too closely. They were cousins, not first cousins, but like 3rd or 4th cousins. As it turns out, she was actually even closer related to Henry. And they kind of knew that, but it was all, you use the reasons for your own purposes, and you disregard the rules as you need them. Henry actually was, at one point, wanting to get an annulment from Eleanor, after she had rebelled against him, and he had her put up in the tower, or not in a tower, but kept on house arrest. He was thinking of ways of getting an annulment, and he was going to do that, but Henry, unlike Louis, was not willing to give up the lands that Eleanor still had. As long as he was married to her, he controlled those lands. If he got an annulment, the lands would go with her. And so ultimately he couldn't figure out a way to disentangle himself from her without losing the land. So he did not get an annulment. So we are on to Joan of Arc. One of the most amazing stories. Bibliography here. This first one, Polly Shore Brooks, I had her also for Eleanor of Aquitaine. She had written a teen book about both of these women, Beyond the Myth, the story of Joan of Arc. So it's 175 pages. It's intended for middle school to high schoolers. So it's an easy read, pretty good work. The next one, more towards adults, Mary Gordon, 179 pages, Joan of Arc. A very good read if you want a quick read of Joan of Arc. I would recommend this one very highly. This next one, Regine Pernaud, Joan of Arc by Herself and Her Witnesses. This is a really good one because he uses the court transcripts and quotes them extensively in this book, so that you are getting the words of her and the words of others who had testified about her. One of the great things about studying Joan of Arc is that we know a lot more about her because of the trials that were to condemn her and to reverse that condemnation. Very extensive records that have been kept. And this last one, Catherine Harrison, Joan of Arc, 382 pages, more involved. It gets a lot more detail as to the family backgrounds of the kings and so on, and the day and the philosophy and what the mindset of the people of the day. So that one, it's a good one too. So now, we're going to talk a little bit about the movies. The Passion of Joan of Arc, 1928. This was a silent film. And if you are into say this right, cinematography, you might know of this film because it was kind of a landmark film. I took this picture as representing the film because if you watched the film, you will see a lot of this. A lot of close-up of her suffering. It's her trial and all the agonies that she went through and being questioned and her answers. And you will, as I say, you'll see a lot of this on your screen. I've heard that this actress, this poor actress, after she was done with this, nearly had a nervous breakdown because it was so trying for her. One thing that the director insisted that she do is spend a lot of time on her bare knees on bricks, and he told her to suppress any pain she felt. That is the look I'm going for here. I want this pain to be inner pain, and I want you to feel it. So she suffered through this. This one, 1948, Ingrid Bergman. How can you not like her? She's fantastic. Of course, it's not entirely historical, as movies never are. If you're a fan of Ingrid Bergman, you'll like the movie. It's fairly well done as movies go. It's, in my imagination, Joan of Arc is nothing like Ingrid Bergman, though. So but as a movie, it's all right. Now, this next one is a movie that I really liked, and I don't say that often. This movie, made in 1999, the beginning of the movie and the ending of the movie, where they do the whole trial and imprisonment, I don't much care for. The action scenes I absolutely love, and I'm going to have a clip of this midway through the lecture. But she does a fantastic job of portraying a very ambitious, headstrong young girl that people had to really work at to take seriously, but she took herself very seriously. But you'll see it in this clip that I have coming up. So Joan has been an inspiration through the years for many different people of all walks of life. Writers, artists, politicians, philosophers, men and women, Catholics and Protestants, communists and monarchists, all have looked to her for inspiration over the years. Mark Twain wrote a novel of Joan of Arc, and he was absolutely enthralled with her. Unfortunately, critics will tell you it's probably the worst novel he ever wrote. And in fashion, we have the Joan of Arc bobbed haircut. In 1909, a hairdresser came up with this idea. Joan of Arc was making a resurgence, and people were talking about her. And so he thought he would be an enterprising man and push this new fashion of the bobbed look. And as we know, in the 1920s, the flappers all liked this bobbed look that was inspired by Joan of Arc. Now, to get back to the story, it starts with the 100 Years' War. It's essentially over who's going to rule France. The King of England and the King of France, for many years, actually even going back before the 100 Years' War, you go back to William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror came from Normandy. He came over and conquered England, but he still had Normandy. So the King of England still had territory in France. As the years progressed and the families intertwined, and as kings came and kings went, it got more and more enmeshed. And so when a king of France dies without an heir, and his nearest heir is a prince or princess of England, you get a tangle that was very difficult to unwind. And basically, it's we will solve this by force of arms. Each side has their claims, and we'll see who wins in the end. King Henry V and Charles VI. Charles VI of France, being a rather strange sort of guy and schizophrenic, periodically would go absolutely mad. His first really bad episode, he was out hunting with an entourage, and he went nuts on his horse and started wielding his sword at anyone near him. He killed 4 of his attendants before they finally got him off the horse and tackled him and took the sword from him. But it came and went. He wasn't always crazy or schizophrenic. He would have his times of lucid mind. But the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, was a great devastation for the French. A whole thousands of French nobility were killed in this battle. And as you know, Shakespeare wrote a absolutely wonderful play, Henry V. We've all seen Henry V, right? Shakespeare. Kenneth Branagh has the best version. If you've ever seen Kenneth Branagh's Henry V, it's well worth seeing. So, since France was devastated and England was in the ascendant, they had a treaty, the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. Henry married Charles VI's daughter, and they were going to be the heirs of the crown. When Henry VI was to die, Henry V was supposed to inherit the crown. But then in 1422, both of them died. So we have Charles VII, the Dauphin, who was a terribly weak, vacillating sort of character. I have a really great quote, if I could find it here, that describes him. Here we go. Physically and mentally, Charles was a weakling, a graceless degenerate. He was stunted and puny, with a blank face in which scared, sleepy eyes peering out on either side of a big, long nose failed to animate his harsh, unpleasant features. That was one of his contemporaries describing Charles VII, who was the Dauphin, the prince who was to be the king. Now, since England had taken up so much territory, and France, the French people were so dispirited, Charles was not crowned right away. And this was, for some people, they still called him the king. He was still looked to and called Your Majesty, but he wasn't officially crowned for some years. His mother, who contributed greatly to his infirmities, she had 11 children. She was a very promiscuous woman, which, as you know, that sort of thing is allowed in men. It is not allowed in women, especially if you're the queen. She did not. She disowned her own son and would sometimes tell him that, by the way, I do not believe that the king was your father. She had 11 children, and it's suspected that a number of them did not belong to Charles VI. So here is Charles VII. Rather homely looking sort of guy. And so we come to the Siege of Orleans. The English are now in control of northern France, all the way to Paris. Orleans is in an area that is a very rich, fertile river area, the Loire River. And if the English could take that city, there would be almost nothing left to defend of France. This was the last city of any size that the English could take. So they laid siege in 1428. They had it surrounded on 3 sides, and they were going to try to starve the people out. One of the problems that the English had is they were taking up so much territory that they were running low on men to lay siege to Orleans. And so they had 3 sides, and it was tough going getting to the 4th. So just as a short description of some of the weapons of the day, cannons, as we know them, were very primitive and were just at this time coming into their own as a powerful weapon against the walls of castles. It was well known that they could be more powerful than a trebuchet or catapult of any kind. They were also more dangerous because sometimes they might just explode and kill the people who are operating it. But They were valuable. And then there's the culverin, which was kind of the precursor to a rifle or a pistol, where it's basically just a cannon that you hold and somebody lights it up and it shoots, maybe about an inch or so in diameter of a rock. And also very scary for people who are defending the castle. So here is Orleans. The English have this side of Orleans, and over here, this side is still kind of open. They have a small garrison out here, and things are looking fairly bleak because the French are fairly dispirited, and the tide seems to be going for the English. And then comes our hero, or heroine. She was born, we think, in 1412 to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romée in Domremy, eastern France. Jacques is a farmer and a minor official in this tiny little village. Joan, as a child, is known for being a very pious young girl, always wanting to go to church, to say her prayers. The only education that she got was from her mother. She never learned to read or write, except her name, Joan. And I think I should say here that Joan of Arc is a misnomer. She was never called Joan of Arc in her lifetime. That is an English flub, you might say. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, D''Arc, that was his name. It was not where he was from. There is no arc in France to be from. In English, we think of the D as, we translate it as of, or Jacques of Arc. And that's not how it's meant originally. Last names as a whole were kind of a new thing back in those days, in the 1400s. It was mostly for nobility to have last names. If you were a peasant, you may not have a last name at all. You might just say your name and you are from such and such a village. Joan, when she was on trial and they asked her her name, she would say, she always called herself Joan or Jeanette, the maid. And they asked her what her last name was, and she didn't know that she had one. It never occurred to her that she would even have a last name, because they were optional, and she knew that her father had one, but probably never thought much of it. And by the way, as you can see, Isabelle, her mother was Isabelle Romée, because we believe that she had taken a pilgrimage to Rome at some point, and so she took that as her last name. Last names were not necessarily, the wife did not necessarily have the same last name as the husband. It was all being sorted out at the time. And here is the home of Joan of Arc as it stands today. And this is in the village of Domremy. So this young girl at the age of 13 starts hearing voices. This very pious young woman who loves to go to church and say her prayers and pray to the Virgin Mary and the saints. She starts hearing voices. She doesn't tell anybody at this time that she hears voices, but she's hearing them. At first, they tell her, they encourage her to be a good girl, and generalities of that sort. we assume that that included that you stay a virgin, at least for now. Being a good girl, one of the essential things in that is that you stay a virgin before your marriage. We know that at the age of 16, she was brought to trial, brought to court, because some young man in the village said that they were betrothed to be married, and she broke it off. And that was against the law. When you are betrothed, that is a promise, just like being married, almost as much. And you cannot break that without some sort of penalty. So they went to court, and she presented her side of the case and said, I never promised him anything. And she won the case. The court found that there was no evidence that she made a promise. And it was important, even in those days, that the young girl voluntarily get married and accept of her own volition her husband. Her father apparently was not very happy about this. This may have been, and we're not sure, but this may have been an arranged marriage that the father insisted that she marry this guy. Because in the court records, it says that this was one of the few times that she disobeyed her parents. And she said there were 2 times she disobeyed her father. This was one of them. So Joan is experiencing the 100 Years' War herself. There was a raid on her little village, and they had to go stay with relatives as the soldiers rampaged through the countryside in Domremy. And here's a very nice painting of Joan, and you can see right here the angels and saints who are speaking to her. So at this point, at 17, Michael the archangel is telling her that she is going to be the one who's going to lift the siege of Orleans, that God has chosen her to inspire the French to beat back the English and to have King Charles crowned in Reims. So the voices that she is hearing, St. Margaret, St. Catherine, and St. Michael the Archangel. Margaret and Catherine are saints who back in the Roman days were martyred. They had their heads lopped off. And both of them significantly were known as virgin martyrs. They refused to be forced into a marriage with a pagan king of some sort, and that's why they were martyred. And that's most likely why Joan loved them, because they were virgin martyrs. So they command Joan to raise the siege of Orleans and have the Dauphin anointed king. Now, I've been practicing this word because it's very difficult for me. Vaucouleur. Say that for me. Vaucouleur. Vaucouleur. Yes. Vaucouleur. That's a tough one. So Joan, she's hearing these voices. She isn't telling anybody yet. But in order to get to Orleans, she knows she has to convince somebody to support her. The nearest town with a garrison, Vaucouleur.
Très bien.
Merci. Yeah. The nearest town with a garrison that she could talk to somebody in charge is in this town, Vaucouleur. And so she has to speak with Captain Baudricourt. But in order to do that, she has to tell her father kind of a fib. She tells her father that she's going to stay with her uncle for a few days, and that was okay. her father, sometime before this, had a dream, and he told his sons that in this dream, Joan went to run away with the military sort, and she was going to be a camp follower of these soldiers. Now, we all know what a woman is who is a camp follower of soldiers. That's a prostitute. And anybody knows that, especially back in those days. And so her father, said to her brothers, if she ever does this, I want you to drown her in the nearest river. And if you don't, I will. So he had very strong feelings about this. And so she knew that if she was going to run off with the soldiers, she had to do it secretively. And so she told her father, I'm going to go stay with Uncle, and don't worry about me. And so she went away, and she immediately, in Vaucouleurs, went to Captain Baudricourt and told him that my lord has told me that I need to see the king and help him in the siege of Orleans. And he says, well, who is your lord? And she says, God. And he said, go home, and your father should be boxing your ears right now. But she had a following there. She spent some time, since she couldn't convince him right away, she spent some time there and talking to other people. One thing about Joan, that if you knew her, she's very convincing in everything that she did. Some of the statements on your handouts, you'll see she's a very direct sort of person. For a girl who had no education, she could be very persuasive. And so the people in the town started thinking of her as someone who is credible. And so they started sending messages. And even the court where the king was started hearing that there's this young girl who claims that she's from God and is going to raise the siege of Orleans. And so the message came back to Captain Baudricourt to take her seriously. Now, it is true that back in those days, this sort of thing was not that unusual. For someone to come, especially in times of stress, for someone to come and say, God has chosen me to inspire the troops, to lead them into victory in battle, is not as unusual as we may think of it today. There actually was another woman in town who was saying the same thing. Unfortunately for her, she came off as a nut, as most people do who claim that that God is speaking to them. The big difference between Joan and the other sorts of people who would say that God is leading them and sending messages to them to help out the military. The big difference with Joan is she's entirely believable. 17 years old, perfectly confident in what she is doing, and looking entirely sane, unlike others who look absolutely nuts. And this other woman, and another strike against her, this other woman, she was married with kids. Sorry, you're not a virgin. Virgins have special status back in those days. And if you were a virgin, this is something that Joan was very strict about herself. She called herself Joan the Maid. In other words, I am a virgin, which gives me a special sanction from God and special powers, almost like Samson with his long hair. When Samson lost his long hair, he lost the favor and strength from God. If Joan were to lose her virginity, no doubt she would have lost her confidence as well that God was leading her. And so she guarded it very strictly. So she goes to see the king, who's at Chinon. She had a 7-man escort, and also at this time they gave her men's clothes to wear, and this is where she gets her hair cut, and she's wearing men's clothes now. She has to travel 350 miles through enemy territory. Wearing men's clothes at this point is a safeguard. If you are a woman traveling through the countryside, you better have a good-sized escort. You will be captured, you will be raped. They made it in 11 days. Do the math, that's a lot of miles each day. The soldiers who were her escort, they testified later that they looked at her and she was a rather attractive young girl, and they were thinking of making moves on her. They were very attracted. But because Joan had this powerful personality and was so pious in everything that she did, that greatly impressed them. And they decided, well, maybe not. They became very respectful of her because she inspired such religious piety among the people that she was around. And so we come to this famous scene, and anytime you have a movie of Joan of Arc, you have this scene where she is to meet the Dauphin, and they were going to trick her. In the movies, they always have somebody sitting on the throne who's somebody else, and she's supposed to walk up, and this is a test. Is she going to recognize that this guy is not the king? And so she walks in. In real life, there wasn't anybody sitting on a throne, anything like that. But there was a crowd of 300 or so people, and the king, Charles, was not making himself stand out in any way. He was not dressed any differently than anybody else, and so they were going to see if she could pick him out. And she did. Now, those who want to believe in a miracle can say this was from God. God showed her who the king was. Historians will generally say something along the lines of, his face stands out, and everybody knew essentially what he looked like. Also, she was in town for a few days before she went to this hall to meet him, and she could have had someone with her who was also kind of helping her along. So, if you want to believe in miracles, you can. If you want to believe that she could kind of pick him out just by his looks, you can as well. Anyway, in any case, she picks him out. You are the Dauphin. She falls to her knees, grabs his legs, and says, I have a message for you. I need to talk with you privately. And so they go into a private room, and she says something to him that we don't know. There's been a lot of speculation as to what she would have said. Some people say it was a dream that he had that she knew, and she told him what he had dreamed, and so he was very impressed. Others will say that she was just a very impressive person. And when she says, God told me this message to you, it really impressed him. In any case, they come out and he's perfectly convinced. However, he needs more evidence, and his advisors are saying that we need to interrogate her. And so for 3 weeks, they had a group of clergy questioning her. Of course, they have to make sure she's a virgin, so they have some women examine her, and they say, yes, she is a virgin. But they interrogated her for 3 weeks, questioning her about her voices and what God has supposedly said to her. And they, after those 3 weeks, say, yes, we find no harm in her, at least. And even at this point, we don't have the records, unfortunately, of this particular interview. We have a couple of quotes that have come down that show at this point she's bold to the point of rudeness. When they ask questions like, do you believe in God? Very simple enough question. She answers back, better than you. One of the questioners asked, well, did the angels speak French? Well, yes, they spoke French. Did they have an accent? Because depending on where you are in France at that time, you may have a very thick accent in various parts of France. And apparently the guy who was questioning her was from a particular part of France and had an accent himself. And so when he asked, did he speak French? She answered, better than you. So yeah, she was a very self-confident young lady. And here's a painting of Joan meeting Charles VII, the Dauphin. So after the 3 weeks, and they are convinced that Joan is for real, they send her off to Orleans to inspire the men. And before she goes, they make a suit of armor for her. And at this point, we see Joan as not just some rugged soldier who has armor on, but she's also really into the latest fashions. She loved silks, and she got her armor, but she was wearing silk and all the latest in fashions, probably with ostrich feathers and whatnot. So she was kind of a dandy in that sense. She loved fashions. Also, she has a banner made just for her, and it looks like this. They say it was about 8 feet long and had Jesus being crucified and Mary and the fleur-de-lis. And this is a statue of her with this gold robe that she had worn also. And then she writes a letter to the English, basically announcing her presence and letting them know that they need to leave France. And here's an excerpt from it. You Englishmen who have no right in this kingdom of France, the King of Heaven orders and commands you through me, Joan the maid, that you quit your fortresses and return to your own country, or if you will not, I shall make such hay that the memory of it will be perpetual. That was a term I'd never heard before. Hay. I'm going to make hay of you. But that's what she said. And so she goes to Orleans, and she arrives there. The man in charge was known as the Bastard of Orleans. Being a bastard, back in those days, would hold you back from some offices, but it was not always just a term of derision as we would think of it. He was royalty, he was nobility. And so even though he was a bastard, he still held offices and he was well respected. And his name was Jean of Dunois, I think. Yeah, if I'm pronouncing that, Dunois. But he was more commonly known as the Bastard of Orleans. And that's how he was often addressed. So Joan arrives, and she's rather angry. She wants to get into the action immediately. She doesn't want to wait around. The Bastard of Orleans decided that they need to get supplies into Orleans. And that's what we're going to do first, before anything. We're low on supplies, we need to get them in, and Joan, that's what we're doing at first. And so this is the interaction. This is what Joan has to say about it. Did you give the order that I should come here this side of the river instead of where the English are? And he says, yes, I gave that order. In God's name, the counsel of God is safer and wiser than yours. I bring you better help than any knight or city. I bring you the help of the King of Heaven. They got the supplies in. That's what they were going to do. She was very angry, but there wasn't anything she could do about it. But instead of fighting at that day, she performed another one of her miracles. They were waiting. They were on the other side of the river. They were waiting for the wind to change so that they could get to the other side of the river and unload the supplies. And he basically told her, we just have to wait for the wind to change. And she said, don't worry about that. It will change now. And it did. And they're all, ooh, that was kind of spooky. And so she comes to Orleans. The news of Joan has spread well in advance of her arrival, and people are ecstatic to see her. She comes into town, and people are crowding all around her, wanting to touch her, and almost to the point of worshiping her. It's a great painting. I like this one. One of the things that Joan would tell people that she doesn't do, she doesn't perform miracles. And she would have to tell people this all the time, because as she comes in, people are thinking, all I have to do is touch her and my illness will go away, or I will be healed of something. And she would have to tell them again and again, I do not perform miracles. I don't heal people. One time, a woman came up to her and said, the wounded need you. They want you to come and comfort them. They want you to come and touch them to heal them. And she said, go touch them yourself. It will do just as much good. So the first battle, St. Loup, and you'll see on your map, that's the one off to the right. This was a few days later. Joan was waiting very impatiently, and the Bastard of Orleans, the commander, started the battle without her. And she woke up early in the morning, very angry, knowing that the battle is going on. She had her attendant put her armor on, and she rides out there, and just as everybody was retreating, the French had been beaten back. It's over with. And she rides up and says, follow me, man. And they did. And they went out and took the garrison. So this is St. Loup, a small little garrison out here. And she had ridden out and beaten back, gotten the English kicked out of their own little fort there. So that was their first success. And everybody was really crazy happy for her. Now this is the clip that I told you about. There is another movie that was made, I think it was a TV movie about Joan of Arc, that I watched just a few minutes of, and I absolutely could not stand it. Because the girl who is portraying Joan of Arc, to me, reminded me of a spoiled teenage girl getting upset at her social studies teacher. And that's very personal with me. So watch this. This one gives me chills to watch.
This morning, God gave us a great victory. It is nothing compared to what He is ready to give us now. I know you are all tired and hungry, but I swear to you that even if these English were hanging from the clouds by their fingertips,
There's actually a better clip that I wish I could have put in here, and I just couldn't get it to work. But yes.
Did Charles give her the horse too, as well as the armor?
What's that?
Who gave her the horse?
Yeah, she was actually given several horses.
Was she?
Yeah, at various points. When she became a popular figure, as they say, nothing succeeds like success. And when you're on the rise, people are willing to give you. And so, yeah, she got the white horse. But yeah, there's a number of people who were giving her things at this point. So, the second battle, they had to go across the river. At this point, Joan is now allowed in the war councils because she's actually producing results. So they had to cross the river. She rallies the men again, pushes the English back. At this point, she received a very serious wound in the neck and shoulder. An arrow pierced her and went through. We're not really sure how deep it was. It did go through. Well, we just don't know where exactly it was. But she was carried from the field. The battle went on, and they got the arrow out. She rested for a little while, and then she came back to finish the job. So even though she had an arrow through her, they patched her up. She spent some time, had some lunch or something, but she came back. And finished the job and kicked the English out. And on that, by the way, her eating habits were very sparse. It was noted by a number of men that she ate very little, that she was almost like an ascetic, eating just a couple of times a day and not very much at that. So at this point, the English have been beaten back in 2 places and are looking pretty grim. The English still outnumbered, their soldiers outnumbered the French soldiers, but the tide was turning and they could see it. So the English on the next day, which was Sunday, they lined up for battle. Joan allowed that the men should line up, but she said, "We are not going to fight today. We're not going to attack unless they attack us." So the English lined up, the French lined up, then the English marched away. They had given up. And now, May 8th, which was the day that they marched out, is a holiday in Orleans, and they celebrate. They have a very large Joan this year. Yeah, she eats a bit more than Joan does. So it's Joan of Arc Day.
So they celebrated whether it's Sunday or not, right?
I would imagine so. Yeah. And so the next step was to get Charles VII anointed king. There were a few other battles of minor towns to take, and they took them fairly easily. On their, first around Orleans, then she goes to see Charles. Charles is somewhat reluctant. As I say, he was a very vacillating, weak sort of person, and she had to convince him to do this, even though it was something that everybody really expected. That's what the king is supposed to do. You get crowned when you become king. So they have to travel to Reims and have to take a few towns along the way. Sometimes they would just present themselves and the town would change sides and give in. Other times they had to lay siege for a few days. They arrive at Reims, and Charles is still very reluctant. Joan, at some point, had to just make the announcement herself, even though the king wasn't even in on it. we are going to crown the king tomorrow. And she told the king later that she had just made that announcement. And so the king was crowned in Reims Cathedral. This is from the very beginning. Clovis, the first king, was crowned here, and so every king of France was supposed to be crowned there. Now, a lot of the dukes and barons were not present like they're supposed to be, since a lot of them were in rebellion, but it was the official crowning of King Charles VII. And Joan got to be in on the ceremony with her banner. Hers was the only banner that was allowed to be in on this coronation. And she was asked later, why is it that you get to have your banner and the other soldiers don't get to carry theirs? And she said, my banner did all the work. Yeah, modest she was not. It's at this point that the magic seems to dissolve for Joan. She accomplished her main goals. She relieved Orleans. The king is now anointed king. And so Joan, at an earlier time, she had suggested that once she gets Charles crowned, that she may be done with her mission and go back home. That was not something that Joan was going to do. Joan was not the kind of person who could go back home at this point and live an ordinary life. She loved being a soldier. She loved being with soldiers. She loved the camaraderie. She loved the company of men much more than she did women. And so she was going to continue until the English were entirely kicked out of France. She failed at Paris. Once the king was crowned, she was at her height of popularity. Many men joined up with the army. That was both a blessing and a curse. Charles, in his state, did not have a lot of money. War is always very expensive. And so Charles, with all of these new soldiers, essentially could not pay them and could not feed them. So the enthusiasm only lasted so long. So once she failed at Paris. She laid siege, couldn't take it. So she spent some time at court, a couple of months with Charles. She was very anxious to proceed, but Charles wanted her to be kind of a show in his court. And so he put her on display and he enjoyed having her around, or wanted to anyway. She hated it. She wanted to be a soldier. She loved being out in the field. And so after a couple of months, she couldn't take it anymore and went back to fight. She went to a small town of Charity and failed again to take the town. La Charité. Thank you. La Charité. Okay.
And the next one is Compiègne.
Oh, I was going to say that. Compiègne. I've been practicing these. Compiègne.
You're given credit.
Thank you. Thank you. Muy bien. Not muy bien. I'm doing it. Merci. Merci.
Molto bene.
Yeah, okay. Compiègne. She goes to relieve Compiègne that is being besieged by the English. And it's at that point that Joan is captured. It was a hopeless case. She was not going to relieve Compiègne. She had way too few soldiers. She had about 400 as opposed to several thousand of the English. But she wanted to attack anyway. And as they were beaten back and they were going back to their own fort, Joan, being the brave soldier that she was in the rear guard protecting her men. She was not leading them into safety. She was protecting them as they went to safety. And she was captured. They raised the drawbridge before all of them could come in because the English were too close. Some have claimed afterwards that it was some sort of treachery on the part of the French, that they wanted her to be captured. But historians will tell you that no, the commander in charge had to raise the drawbridge because the English were too close for comfort. And so she's captured. And now she's really being tortured because she's in prison, held by the Duke of Luxembourg at first, and she cannot stand being cooped up. A very hyperactive young lady being held in a room was sheer torture for her. So she tried to escape twice. The first time was fairly easy. She lifted up some floorboards in the prison and got out. But of course, she was captured right away. The second time she tried to escape, she was in a tower 70 feet above the ground. She jumped. Now, apparently, she fell into a moat that was empty. And so we're guessing that the ground was fairly soft. She was unconscious for 2 days, but broken no bones. She finally came around, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. This is one of the things that they questioned her about in the trial. Was she trying to kill herself? And she was actually a little ambivalent about it. Anyway, she was then sold to the English from the Duke of Luxembourg. Really should have been on the side of the French. But anyway, the English now have her. And Charles, I must say, did absolutely nothing to get her back. He did not offer a ransom to get her back. He wrote a letter of protest, and that was about it. So it was evident that Charles, and it was a lot of his counselors too, who were very much against Joan, who wanted to do nothing but negotiate with the English and not fight battles. They were very much against Joan from the beginning, and were only waiting for a time when they can be rid of her. So even though there were some French who were very happy to be rid of her, it still was not treachery that she was captured. But it was, in a sense, treachery that they offered no ransom for her. The English bought her for 10,000 pounds, which really wasn't an exorbitant amount at that time. And here's supposedly the tower that she jumped from, and I'm beginning to doubt it now. But anyway, I looked this up, and this is what I got online. So it was somewhere between 60 and 70 feet that she fell. And so we come to the trial. She spends about 5 months in captivity before she is finally put on trial. It takes them a while to get this all together. Bishop Cauchon
means pig.
It means pig?
Yes.
How about that? Very fitting title for him. He was the lead judge. There were about 60 churchmen, including the clerks, to write down the testimony. And they were very enthusiastic. This was a show trial. She was going to be found guilty. There was no doubt of that. There were a few who were conscientious, clerics there, and doubted that the proceedings were being held legally, and doubted some of the proceedings that were happening. Those clerics were promptly kicked out of the trial, and some of them were actually put in prison for a short time. A lot of intimidation to make sure that the trial goes the way they want it to. So
the British are in charge here, right?
yes, but there's Frenchmen who are doing it.
Yeah.
The English are basically in charge, but these are mostly French clerics who are under the thumb of the English.
And what was she accused of?
There. So she was interrogated. You know, I told you before, the others interrogated her for 3 weeks. This went on for 3 months, asking her innumerable questions about her visions, about the saints and the angels. It's kind of it's interesting to see if you read through the testimony, and some of the quotes are really kind of bizarre. The questions that they would ask. So you saw them with your eyes. Yes, I saw them. Did you touch them? Yes. Did you hug them? Yes, I hugged them. Where did you hug them? In the upper part or the lower part? I hugged them. It's more fitting that I hugged their lower part than their upper. Were they clothed? Well, don't you think God could clothe them? Did they have hair? Well, why would they cut their hair? It would go back and forth like that. And then, of course, they're asking about, did they ever speak English? Well, no, they're on the side of the French. They did not speak English. But they asked her all, from her childhood up until the present time, they asked her all kinds of questions. And some of this is where we find out that she had gone to court because a young man had taken her there on breach of promise. Also, let's see. And they asked her, of course, about her clothing. If you are a very good Bible scholar, you will know that in the Old Testament, God is very clear. Women are not to wear men's clothes, and men are not to wear women's clothes. It is an abomination. So they say, why are you wearing men's clothes? And she said, God commanded me to, and I will not. And they said, we'll give you women's clothes. Will you wear them? Not until God tells me to change my clothes will I change my clothes. So that was a real stickling point for them and her. And there she is in court. One other thing I wanted to say, she was known as someone who could cry very easily, usually in anger, when she was yelling at the English that they need to leave the place, that God has commanded her to lead the army, and if they care for their own souls, they should leave. And they would yell back at her. They'd call her a whore or a cowgirl or some other derisive names. And she would very angrily be crying at this point and yelling back at them. And it was said that she could cry very easily at that kind of name calling. In the trial, 3 months of hard questioning, no one ever said that she broke down in tears. She never cried. She held up valiantly through the whole thing. But of course, it was a foregone conclusion that they were going to condemn her. Initially, they drew up 70 articles against her and then condensed it down into 12. I've actually printed them out, and it really doesn't make for very interesting reading. I wish I could say it did, but it's not well organized. Some of the charges against her are mentioned 2 or 3 times. These 12 articles, they're mostly like 2 or 3 paragraphs apiece, and they're not very specific on what they are condemning her for. There's just a whole list of things that she did and said. Now, we know that essentially it came down to wearing men's clothes was one thing, disobeying her parents, which was another very serious charge. the whole hearing voices thing, they really tried to get her on that. And although it's mentioned in the articles, it's not one of the things that they were clear about. This is why we're condemning you, because they would believe that God does talk to people through angels. And so for her to say that she heard voices from God, from the angels, was not necessarily a crime. Another thing that they charged her with was disobeying the church. They are the representatives of the church. If she's not going to follow what they say, that is another charge. And so she's condemned.
In the interest of full disclosure, Cochon is pronounced the same way but spelled differently. Pig is spelled with an O, C-O-H-O-N.
Is it pronounced the same?
Yeah.
Cochon, okay. Okay. So he's not completely a pig.
No.
Okay. So Joan is given a choice. She can recant all of what she has done and submit to the church, or she's going to be burned at the stake. At one point, Cochon preaches a sermon, and they show her various instruments of torture which they may use on her. And they take her to the place of execution where she would be burned to death. And she recants. She is in fear of the fire more than anything. And so she says, I'll take it back. I submit. What she was hoping for and what she was probably promised was that she would be in prison the rest of her life, but she would be in a woman's prison, not a man's. So after she recants and she signs a paper that she can't read, and then they tell her, okay, now your sentence is life in prison in a man's prison. And then she said, no, that is not what I was thinking was going to happen. So she goes back and says, I take it all back. I do not recant what I said and did. And so she is sent to the stake to be burned May 30th, 1431. And there's an image of her. As she was taken to the stake, she was asking somebody, anybody, please give me a cross that I can hold. And one young man gave her a couple of sticks to hold, and she held it as a cross against her breast. And then, as she was tied up, a clergyman, as this scene shows, lifted a cross to her for her to see. And I'll say, too, that if you are being burned at the stake, it's obviously one of the most horrendous executions that anybody could suffer. But it could be a fairly quick operation if they want it to be. If they put enough wood on there to get the fire going really hot, you could be dead within 5 or 10 minutes. Joan lasted a half an hour. They made sure that it was not quick for her. And it was said that in her last dying moments, she screamed out, Jesus, 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 several times. And those were her last words. But even though Joan is gone, her spirit lives on. After she passed, she was executed, the tide was turning for the French. The French are becoming more nationalistic, and Joan is kind of a symbol now, a very great symbol for them in their battle against the English. And those who had sided with the English now are turning. It was not overnight. It took some years, but the tide was obviously turning. In 1435, Charles finally gets Paris back. And Charles is now coming into his own as a king. He is maturing into the man that he should have been all along. And when he takes Paris, he lets the people know that he forgives everybody. He is not going to prosecute traitors and execute people in mass. And they loved him for it. The last battle of the 100 Years' War, 1453, they take Bordeaux, and that is when historians say officially the 100 Years' War is over. And then they have a retrial. Now that people are feeling a lot better about Joan, they are going to try her again. And there's actually 3 trials. There was a preliminary trial in which they had a few witnesses and they wanted to proceed from there. And then there was a second one, and then the final, 1456, 115 witnesses, virtually everybody who ever knew her, soldiers, childhood friends, now are coming forward and testifying. And this is another great source for us that we now know so much about her because of these testimonials. And so she is vindicated at that point. And then in 1920, she becomes a saint. So that is Joan of Arc. Are there any questions? Yes?
How old was she when she was burned?
She was 19 at that point. So she was 17 when she first started. She was at Orleans. And then after the initial successes that she had, she was for several months doing minor battles and failing. Then she was captured and kept for several months. And so she was 19 when she was executed. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. So next week, Queen Elizabeth the First.
I won't move.